Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The Priory was a big old house. It was very beautiful, but parts of it were broken and not fixed. Jack Sheraton got the house after a family member who was very careful with money died. Only part of the house was in good condition. The rest of it was falling apart and looked like an old, pretty ruin. Jack and his family came to see the house for the first time. They came for a holiday and planned to stay for 1 month. They brought Thatcher, little Molly's nurse, to help with everything. They had only been in the house for 1 hour when a telegram came. Thatcher's mother was very sick and dying, so Thatcher had to leave. A few days later, Jack also had to leave because of important work in town. I will go to the lodge and ask Mrs. Summers to come early this morning. She can stay with you tonight so you won't be alone for long, Jack said as he left quickly. Millicent, Jack's wife, and their daughter Molly watched him go. Then they went back to the breakfast room. Molly played with her doll while her mother cleaned up the breakfast table. Millicent was not afraid of most things, but she started to feel worried. The Priory was far from other houses. The nearest house, the lodge, was a 30-minute walk away. There was another big building far away in the other direction, but they didn't know what it was. Since they got married, Jack had never left her alone for even 1 night. Now she didn't even have Thatcher to stay with her. Mrs. Summers will come soon, she said to Molly in a cheerful voice. But Molly was busy playing with her doll and didn't notice her mother was worried. Meanwhile, Jack arrived at the lodge and spoke to Mr. Summers, the gamekeeper. "I'm very sorry, sir, but my wife thought you needed her at 11 o'clock as usual. So, she went early to do her shopping first. I'll tell her to go to the Priory with her things as soon as she gets back home," said Mr. Summers. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Summers had still not arrived. Millicent picked up Molly and carried her upstairs. "We will make the beds together, Molly," she said. She threw Molly playfully onto the soft bed. Molly laughed and asked her to do it again. "Wait, that must be Mrs. Summers," Millicent said as she heard footsteps outside. "That's great, Mrs. Summers." "I'm so happy you're here," Millicent called. But no one answered. She thought she was wrong and went back to making the bed. After finishing, she tied a sun hat on Molly's golden hair and took her downstairs. She planned to let Molly play in the garden. But as she walked into the hall, Millicent felt uneasy again. It felt like someone else was in the house. She held Molly's hand tightly and told herself to stop being silly. She went into the dining room. In her husband's chair sat a tall man. He looked polite and well-dressed. The man had already taken off his hat. He was about to open a brown leather bag on his lap. When Mrs. Sheraton entered the room, he stood up and bowed. "I must say sorry for coming into your house like this, madam," he said. "But I'm here for science, so I hope you will forgive me." His words sounded polite, but his way of speaking made Millicent feel very afraid. She knew she must not let him see her fear. "May I ask who you are?" she said, trying to stay calm. And what part of science are you interested in? Of course, madam. My name is Wharton. I am a surgeon, and I study something called vivisection. Really? Said Millicent, trying to keep her voice steady. His way of speaking became more excited as he opened his bag. I came here, he continued, to tell you about a new discovery. I would like to show it to you. He looked at little Molly, who was holding tightly onto her mother's dress. Millicent forced herself to smile. That is very kind of you to visit us, but it is still early. Have you had breakfast? May I get you something to eat? She wished Mrs. Summers would come. But even if she did, what could Mrs. Summers do? By now, Millicent was sure this man was not sane. Thank you, but I do not need breakfast, said the man. He began taking strange, scary-looking tools out of his bag and placing them on the table. Millicent felt terrified inside, but she tried to distract him by talking about random things. He answered politely, but he seemed annoyed. His behavior became more nervous and excited every moment. This won't work, Millicent thought. I have to stay calm and go along with him. She gathered her courage and asked another question. What is this amazing discovery, Mr. Wharton? It is a cure for deafness, madam, he replied. Millicent felt a little better. She thought if it is for deafness, it doesn't involve Molly. For a moment, she forgot he was not a sane man. But then his eyes fixed on Molly again, and he stood up. The cure is perfect, he said. The right ear must be removed, and the inside cleaned out. I will show you. He took a step toward Molly. Millicent turned pale. But Molly is not deaf, she said quickly. There is no need for her to have the operation. It will stop her from ever becoming deaf, he said. Prevention is better than cure. He went back to his tools to pick one. Millicent's heart raced, but she stayed calm. You're right, she said. We should make sure she never becomes deaf. You will need a strong table and good light, won't you? It might be better to do this in another room. That is true, madam. I will also need hot water and towels, he said. Of course, Millicent replied. She led him to the hall and showed him a room that used to be a laundry. It had a long, strong ironing table. Her heart sank as she led him up to the top floor of the house. She guided him through 2 attic rooms into a third one. I'll leave you to get ready while I fetch the hot water and towels, she said. I'll also put Molly into her nightdress. She stepped out and shut the door. The key made a loud sound as she locked it, but the man didn't notice. He was too busy with his tools. Millicent quickly ran through the other rooms, locking their doors too. Then she rushed downstairs. She grabbed Molly and ran out into the garden. At the gate, she stopped to lift Molly onto her back so she could run faster. Millicent had just left the gate when a loud, angry scream came from the house. It made her stop and look up at the attic window. The madman had found out the door was locked. He ran to the window and saw Millicent and Molly running away. Millicent saw him trying to climb out of the window. She did not wait to see if he would climb down the ivy or go into another attic. She prayed for the strength to get somewhere safe and ran as fast as she could. Molly held onto her neck tightly, confused by everything. Millicent kept running, even as the man's screams echoed in her ears. She crossed 3 fields and finally stopped to catch her breath in a quiet lane. Then she heard something. Was it the sound of wheels? Yes! Help! Oh, help! She shouted. Help! 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 A carriage pulled by 2 horses appeared, moving slowly up the hill. The driver stopped when his master gave the order. The man in the carriage was Dr. Shielding, the head doctor of the lunatic asylum, the large building Millicent had seen before. Millicent, shaking and almost fainting, was helped into the carriage. Dr. Shielding told the driver to go home quickly. As they rode, Millicent told him everything, her voice breaking with fear and exhaustion. They soon reached the doctor's house inside the asylum grounds. Dr. Shielding left Millicent and Molly with his wife and daughter. He asked 2 strong men from the asylum to come with him, and they got into the carriage. To the Priory, he said. As they traveled, he told the men about the madman. He explained that the attic was locked, just as Millicent had described. Dr. Shielding also shared that he had been called to help with a doctor from a nearby village who had suddenly gone mad. That doctor had escaped the day before and could not be found. I am sure this is the same man, he said. When they reached the Priory gate, they saw the man. He was trying to climb down the ivy, holding his bag. The man heard their voices and turned to look at them. But as he moved, he lost his grip. He fell to the ground from a great height, still holding his bag. The men hurried to him, but it was too late. The man had hit his head on a large stone and broken his neck. His body shook for a moment and then went still. They took his body to the asylum mortuary and quickly contacted his family. When Dr. Shielding returned home, he found that his wife had asked Millicent and Molly to stay with them until Jack came back. Dr. Shielding agreed completely. The next morning, Jack read about the event in the newspaper. His face turned pale. Then, he opened a letter from Millicent. In her letter, Millicent told him everything. She ended with, "Oh, Jack, I can never go back there again. Please come and take us home." Jack never returned to the Priory. On his way to the train station, he gave the house to an agent to sell. When he arrived at Beechcroft, he asked Mrs. Summers to pack all their belongings from the Priory and send them to their home in town. When Jack finally saw his wife and Molly again, he hugged them tightly. He silently promised himself he would never leave them alone again, not even for an hour.